The transport truck arrived at Camp 21 in Comry, Scotland, on the evening of December 21st, 1944, carrying something unexpected: not more prisoners. The camp already held 4,000 German POWs behind its wire fences. Instead, the truck delivered a problem that would test whether Britain's commitment to the Geneva Convention extended beyond bureaucratic compliance into something approaching actual humanity. Oberleutnant Hans Reckel climbed down from the truck expecting execution. The 28-year-old Luftwaffe pilot had been shot down 3 days earlier over the North Sea, pulled from freezing water by a British destroyer and transported to Scotland through a fog of exhaustion and terror. He'd spent the journey calculating how long Britain would bother with formalities before shooting him. After 5 years of Goebbels's propaganda about British atrocities against captured Germans, Reckel knew exactly what awaited: mass graves, summary executions, torture, the standard treatment any nation gave enemy pilots who'd been bombing their cities. What he got instead was a cup of tea and a biscuit. The reception didn't make sense. The British officer who processed Reckel spoke fluent German, asked about his health with apparent genuine concern, and explained camp procedures with bureaucratic thoroughness. No threats, no violence, just forms, medical examination, and assignment to a barracks. Reckel waited for the other shoe to drop. Surely this civility was preliminary to something darker. Nobody treated enemy airmen kindly, especially not in December 1944, when Germany's V-weapons were still killing British civilians daily. The tea remained the most confusing element. Hot, properly brewed, served in an actual cup rather than a tin mug. The British officer had asked how Reckel took it. Milk? Sugar? As though they were in a cafe rather than a prisoner of war camp. Reckel accepted both, mostly because refusing seemed more dangerous than accepting potential poison. The tea tasted exactly like tea. No strange aftertaste, no drugs. Just ordinary tea that happened to be better than anything Reckel had drunk in 3 years of Luftwaffe service. To understand why this reception seemed so incomprehensible to German prisoners, we need to go back to 1940, when Britain faced a choice about how to treat the first wave of captured enemy soldiers. The decision they made would shape not just prisoner treatment, but the entire character of Britain's homefront war. The summer of 1940 brought Britain an unexpected logistics problem. German prisoners were accumulating faster than anyone had anticipated. The Dunkirk evacuation had captured relatively few German soldiers, but by July the RAF was shooting down Luftwaffe aircraft at rates that created a steady stream of captured airmen. By September, the Battle of Britain had added hundreds more. These weren't battlefield captures where armies processed prisoners in established systems. These were enemy airmen landing by parachute in British fields, often injured, always disoriented, surrounded by civilians who had every reason to hate them. The obvious response would have been harshness. German bombs were destroying British cities. London burned nightly. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool all suffered sustained attacks that killed thousands of civilians. The German prisoners arriving in British camps had participated in those raids, or at minimum supported the military machine conducting them. Public sentiment favoured treating them roughly. Opinion polls in late 1940 showed 63% of British civilians believed captured Germans should receive minimum necessities only, with no consideration beyond Geneva Convention requirements. The War Office had different ideas. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Scotland, appointed to oversee POW interrogation operations, understood something about human psychology that vengeful civilians didn't. Prisoners treated well provided better intelligence than prisoners treated harshly. Brutality created resistance, solidarity, determination to reveal nothing. Kindness, genuine unexpected kindness, created confusion, cognitive dissonance, willingness to talk because the alternative to cooperation seemed less threatening than expected. Scotland wasn't advocating kindness from humanitarian principles, though he probably possessed those too. He was advocating it from cold, pragmatic calculation. Britain needed intelligence about German military operations, aircraft capabilities, unit deployments, technological developments. Captured airmen possessed that information. The question was how to extract it most efficiently. The interrogation centre at Trent Park, a requisitioned estate north of London, became Scotland's laboratory for testing whether decency worked better than coercion. The facility held high-value prisoners, mostly Luftwaffe officers and U-boat commanders, men with detailed knowledge of German operations. Scotland's team developed techniques that would have seemed absurd to interrogators trained in traditional methods. They started with accommodation that resembled hotels more than prison camps, private rooms with actual beds, not bunks, windows with views of parkland, dining rooms where prisoners ate meals on china plates using proper cutlery, lounges with comfortable furniture, books, newspapers, even gramophone records. The entire facility was designed to make prisoners forget they were prisoners, to create an environment where conversations happened naturally rather than under duress. The catching was subtle. Every room was microphones. Conversations between prisoners, discussions during meals, private remarks made thinking nobody listened, all recorded by hidden devices and transcribed by German-speaking intelligence officers working in basement rooms the prisoners never saw. The British weren't trying to break prisoners through interrogation. They were simply letting Germans talk freely in comfortable surroundings, then mining those conversations for intelligence. The approach violated every propaganda narrative both sides had constructed about prisoner treatment. German prisoners expected British savagery. Instead, they got accommodation nicer than most British officers enjoyed. The cognitive dissonance was intentional and devastating. Prisoners who'd been prepared to resist interrogation through any hardship found themselves disarmed by kindness they couldn't understand or counter. General Major Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured in North Africa in 1942, described his reception at Trent Park as the most disorienting experience of his military career. Von Thoma had commanded panzer divisions, survived the Eastern Front, and expected British captivity to involve at minimum harsh questioning. Instead, the commandant invited him to dinner, actual dinner, multiple courses, wine, conversation about literature and music. Von Thoma spent the evening discussing Goethe with an Oxford-educated British officer who seemed more interested in cultural exchange than military intelligence. The microphones caught everything. Von Thoma, relaxed by good food and civilized conversation, mentioned details about German tank development that formal interrogation would never have extracted. He wasn't trying to reveal secrets. He was simply talking the way people talk when they feel safe and comfortable. The intelligence flowed naturally from conversations that didn't feel like interrogations. This pattern repeated across hundreds of prisoners. Luftwaffe officers discussed aircraft performance over afternoon tea. U-boat commanders debated torpedo tactics during evening card games. Wehrmacht officers analyzed Eastern Front operations in casual lounge conversations. Nobody was being tortured for information. Nobody was even being obviously interrogated. They were just talking, and British intelligence was listening to every word. The success at Trent Park influenced how Britain treated all German prisoners, not just high-value intelligence assets. If kindness worked for interrogation, it might work for general prisoner management too. Not kindness from humanitarian impulses, though those existed, but kindness as practical policy that made administration easier and prisoners more cooperative. The directive came down from the War Office in November 1940. POW camps would comply with Geneva Convention requirements as minimum standard, not maximum aspiration. Prisoners would receive adequate food, medical care, heating, and accommodation. They would be allowed recreational activities, education, even limited interaction with local communities through supervised work programs. The goal was creating stable, manageable prison populations that didn't require excessive guards or create security problems. Camp 21 at Comry exemplified this approach. Built in 1941 to house German and Italian prisoners, the facility held several thousand men behind wire fences in the Scottish Highlands. The Schiedam location was deliberately remote, escape difficult simply due to geography. But within those fences, conditions resembled a Spartan boarding school more than popular imagination's version of prisoner of war camps. Prisoners lived in wooden huts, drafty but weatherproof, with stoves for heating. They received rations matching British Army standards, actually better than what German civilians were eating by 1943. They had access to medical care, education courses, workshop facilities for crafts and repairs, recreational equipment for sports, and a camp library stocked with books in German. The British weren't being generous. They were being practical. Well-fed, occupied prisoners caused fewer problems than hungry, bored ones. Camp 21's security record reflected this calculus. Between 1941 and 1945, the camp experienced exactly 3 escape attempts, all quickly recaptured. Compare that to camps where prisoners were treated harshly, where escape attempts were constant and violent resistance common. The German prisoners couldn't understand it. Every aspect of their treatment contradicted what they'd been taught about British character. Goebbels's propaganda painted Britain as decadent, cruel, run by Jewish conspirators who tortured captured Germans. The reality of Camp 21 matched none of those claims. The commandant was Scottish, not Jewish. The guards were professional, but not cruel. The food was adequate. The accommodation was basic but humane. Hans Reckel spent his first weeks at Camp 21 waiting for the facade to crack. Surely the kindness was temporary, a psychological trick before the real treatment began. He observed everything carefully, looking for signs of the cruelty he'd been promised. The other prisoners, many captured earlier in the war, seemed oddly relaxed. They played football in the exercise yard. They attended education classes learning English. Some worked in supervised labor programs on local farms. The tea kept appearing. Morning tea, afternoon tea, tea with every meal. The British seemed to run on the stuff, and they provided it to prisoners with the same casual abundance they showed their own troops. Reckel had grown up believing tea was what decadent British aristocrats sipped while their empire collapsed. Apparently, it was also what practical Scottish camp commandants used to keep German prisoners calm and cooperative. The breakthrough in Reckel's understanding came from an unexpected source. The camp's medical officer, Captain James Murray, treated a burn injury Reckel had sustained during his bailout. Murray spoke limited German, Reckel spoke limited English, but they communicated through a mixture of both and considerable goodwill. During the examination, Murray mentioned casually that his brother had been killed at Dunkirk. Reckel froze. Here was the moment he'd been expecting. The British doctor, whose brother had been killed by German forces, would surely exact some revenge, even minor cruelty. Instead, Murray simply continued treating the burn with careful professionalism. When he'd finished bandaging it, he offered Reckel a cigarette. Player's Navy Cut, the standard British issue. Murray's explanation, delivered in broken German, reshaped Reckel's understanding of British prisoner policy. War is war. You didn't kill my brother personally. You were doing your duty. I'm doing mine. My duty is making sure prisoners stay healthy. Your duty now is healing and going home when this is over. That pragmatism, that separation between collective conflict and individual treatment, was something German military culture didn't prepare prisoners to expect. Wehrmacht training emphasized total war, absolute commitment, victory or death. The British approach seemed almost casual by comparison. Yes, we're at war. Yes, we're enemies. But that doesn't require personal hatred or cruelty toward prisoners. Just professional duty performed according to international law. The work programs extended this philosophy into unexpected territory. By 1943, British agriculture desperately needed labour. Conscription had taken young men into military service. Food production demands had increased. The solution was using prisoner labour on farms, supervised but treated more like temporary workers than captured enemies. Reckell was assigned to a farm near Crieff in early 1945. Every morning, a truck collected prisoners from Camp 21 and delivered them to local farms needing help. The work was hard, agricultural labour in Scottish winter, but the treatment was remarkable. Farmers paid prisoners small wages, bought them lunch, treated them like hired hands rather than enemies. Some prisoners ate meals with farming families, sitting at kitchen tables discussing crops and weather. The security was minimal. A single guard accompanied each work party, armed but rarely alert. Escape would have been trivially easy. The Highlands offered hundreds of miles of empty territory where fugitives could hide. Yet escapes remained rare. Most prisoners had figured out what the British understood instinctively. The war was ending. Germany was losing. Better to serve out captivity in safety and relative comfort than risk being shot during an escape attempt for no strategic purpose. This realization created strange dynamics. German prisoners at Camp 21 began receiving letters from home describing conditions in Germany. Allied bombing had destroyed cities. Food was scarce. Soviet forces were advancing from the east with a reputation for brutality that made British prisoner camps seem paradisiacal by comparison. Some prisoners realized they were safer and better fed in Scottish captivity than their families were in Germany. The letters revealed something even more disturbing. German civilians believed the propaganda about British atrocity camps. Families wrote asking if prisoners were being starved, tortured, worked to death. Prisoners wrote back describing tea, football matches, education courses, and work on farms where Scottish farmers treated them decently. Their families didn't believe them. Surely the British censors were forcing prisoners to write false reassurances. No enemy nation treated captives well. Kindness in wartime was impossible. Except it wasn't impossible. It was happening daily at Camp 21 and dozens of camps like it across Britain, not because the British were particularly humanitarian, though many individuals certainly were, but because treating prisoners decently was easier, cheaper, and more effective than cruelty. The contrast with German prisoner treatment of Soviet captives made British policy look even more remarkable. German camps on the Eastern Front experienced mortality rates exceeding 50%. Prisoners were deliberately starved, worked to death, shot for minor infractions. The Nazis' racial ideology portrayed Soviets as subhuman, justifying treatment that violated every principle of military honor. German soldiers captured by Soviets could expect similar brutality in return. British prisoners in German camps fared better, but still suffered significantly. Food was inadequate. Medical care was limited. Conditions were harsh. The Germans complied with Geneva Convention minimums for Western Allied prisoners, but rarely exceeded those minimums. Nobody was serving British POWs tea and asking how they took it. This asymmetry confused German prisoners. Why was Britain treating them better than Germany treated British prisoners? The logical answer, that Britain maintained higher standards regardless of reciprocity, contradicted everything Nazi ideology taught about British character. Propaganda claimed Britain was weak, decadent, morally bankrupt. Yet here they were, adhering to international law even when Germany violated it, treating prisoners humanely even when military logic suggested harshness. Some prisoners concluded the British were simply stupid, following rules in warfare, while Germany pursued victory by any means necessary. Others began questioning whether the propaganda had been accurate about anything. If British prisoner treatment was humane rather than cruel, what else had Goebbels lied about? The camp library became an unlikely venue for ideological deprogramming. British authorities stocked it with books in German, including newspapers, literature, and carefully selected political texts. Nothing overtly propagandistic, just material presenting non-Nazi perspectives. Prisoners could read or ignore them as they chose. Reckel started reading out of boredom. Scottish winters were long and dark. Farm work occupied mornings only. Afternoons stretched empty, except for what prisoners created themselves. The library offered escape, and Reckel had always enjoyed reading. The books were revelatory. German newspapers, published by émigrés in London, described the war from perspectives Reckel had never encountered. They reported German defeats honestly. They covered concentration camps, something German military personnel knew existed but rarely discussed. They presented evidence that Germany was losing, the Eastern Front collapsing, the Western Front indefensible, victory impossible. None of this was British propaganda. These were Germans, exiled but German, writing for German audiences about German failures. Reckel couldn't dismiss them as enemy lies. Slowly, reluctantly, he began accepting that the war he'd believed Germany would win was actually lost, had perhaps always been unwinnable once the Soviets and Americans joined Britain. This realization created existential crisis for many prisoners. They'd served Germany believing in ultimate victory, or at minimum, honorable defeat. Learning that their sacrifices had been for a regime that was both losing and morally monstrous destroyed the narratives they'd built around military service. Some prisoners rejected the information entirely. Others, like Reckel, began the painful process of reconstructing their understanding of the war they'd fought. The British authorities encouraged this process indirectly. They didn't lecture prisoners or conduct overt indoctrination. They simply created environments where Germans encountered information their own government had suppressed. Libraries, education courses, discussions with guards who treated them as individuals rather than enemies all contributed to gradual ideological shifts. By spring 1945, as Germany's collapse became undeniable, Camp 21 held prisoners at various stages of disillusionment. Some remained committed Nazis, believing in ultimate German victory despite overwhelming evidence otherwise. Others had begun questioning everything they'd been taught. Most occupied a confused middle ground, uncertain what to believe, but increasingly aware that returning to Germany would mean facing a very different reality than the one they'd left. The end came suddenly. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Camp 21 received the news by radio. The war was over. Germany had lost. British authorities announced that prisoners would be repatriated as transportation allowed, but the process would take months or possibly years. The reaction among prisoners was complicated. Relief that the fighting had ended. Anxiety about returning to defeated Germany. Confusion about what came next, and for many, including Reckel, a strange reluctance to leave. Britain had fed them, treated them decently, even paid them small wages for farm work. Germany offered only ruins, occupation, and association with a regime whose crimes were becoming undeniably clear. Some prisoners asked about staying in Britain, immigrating legally, rather than returning home. The requests were generally denied. British policy required repatriation, clearing camps to make room for demobilizing British troops. But the fact that German prisoners wanted to remain said something profound about how treatment during captivity had reshaped their perspectives. The repatriation process stretched into 1948. Transportation was limited. Germany was chaotic. British authorities prioritized sending prisoners back slowly, maintaining camp order while gradually emptying facilities. During this extended limbo, relationships between guards and prisoners evolved into something approaching normalcy. They weren't friends exactly, but neither were they enemies, just men waiting for bureaucracy to release them. Reckel finally left Camp 21 in October 1947, nearly 3 years after his capture. The train journey to Germany took 2 days, crossing through Netherlands and into British occupation zones. What he found bore little resemblance to the Germany he'd left. Cities were rubble, food remained scarce. Soviet occupation in the east had created a humanitarian catastrophe that made British prisoner camps seem luxurious by comparison. His family had survived barely. They lived in Leipzig, now in the Soviet zone, in an apartment shared with two other families. His father, a Wehrmacht veteran, had been captured by Soviets and spent 2 years in camps that killed half their prisoners. His mother had survived Allied bombing and Soviet occupation. His sister had been raped by Soviet soldiers, a common experience that nobody discussed but everyone knew about. Hearing their experiences, Reckel felt guilty about his own relatively comfortable captivity. He'd been eating adequately while his family starved. He'd been safe while they endured bombing and occupation. He'd been treated decently while they suffered the consequences of the war Germany started and lost. But he also realized something that would shape his post-war life. The British had shown him that enemies didn't require hatred, that international law wasn't weakness, that treating people decently regardless of nationality was possible even during total war. Those lessons seemed incredibly valuable in a Germany that needed to reconstruct not just buildings, but moral foundations. Reckel moved to West Germany in 1949, escaping Soviet occupation. He found work in reconstruction, helped rebuild Frankfurt, eventually started a small business. He never forgot Camp 21, the Scottish farmers who treated him like a person rather than an enemy, the British doctor who dressed his wounds despite losing a brother to German forces, the cup of tea that had seemed so incomprehensible in December 1944. Decades later, in 1982, Reckel returned to Scotland as a tourist. He visited Comry, found the site where Camp 21 had stood. Nothing remained except fields where barracks had been. He walked the perimeter where fences had enclosed 4,000 Germans, trying to reconcile his memories with the peaceful Scottish countryside. A local farmer, elderly but still working, approached him. They talked briefly. The farmer had been young during the war, too young for service, but he remembered the German prisoners working local farms. "Your lot were decent enough," the farmer said. "Worked hard, never caused trouble. Some stayed after the war, married local girls, made lives here." That possibility that some prisoners chose to remain in the country that had defeated and captured them said everything about how Britain's decision to treat enemies humanely had created unexpected consequences. The Geneva Convention required minimum standards. Britain exceeded them not from weakness or naivety, but from understanding that how you treat enemies during war shapes what kind of peace follows. The microphone recordings from Trent Park were declassified in 1999, revealing the intelligence operation behind the comfortable accommodations. Military historians debated whether the kindness was genuine humanitarianism or calculated manipulation. The question missed something fundamental. It was both, and that wasn't contradiction. Britain treated German prisoners decently because it extracted better intelligence, because it simplified administration, because it reduced security problems, and because many British officers and guards genuinely believed in maintaining civilized standards even during total war. The pragmatic and humanitarian motives reinforced each other. Kindness worked both morally and practically. Modern military training on prisoner treatment still references Britain's World War II policies, not because they were perfect, mistakes and abuses certainly occurred, but because they demonstrated that maintaining ethical standards during crisis was possible, practical, and ultimately more effective than abandoning them. Perhaps the deepest legacy appears in personal stories like Reckel's. The thousands of German prisoners who experienced decent treatment from an enemy that had every excuse for vengeance, who returned to Germany with lived proof that the propaganda had been lies, who carried those lessons into post-war reconstruction. They became evidence that different approaches were possible, that the cycle of brutality and revenge wasn't inevitable. The cup of tea offered to exhausted enemy airmen, the medical care provided to wounded prisoners, the wages paid for farm labor. None of these were military necessity. They were choices, deliberate decisions about what kind of nation Britain wanted to be, even when facing existential threat. Those choices mattered not just for the prisoners who benefited, but for the British civilians and soldiers who made them, who proved to themselves that crisis didn't require abandoning civilization. Hans Reckel died in 1996 in Frankfurt, surrounded by family. His obituary mentioned his Luftwaffe service, but focused more on his reconstruction work and business career. It didn't mention Camp 21, the Scottish farmers, or the British doctor who treated him despite personal loss. Those stories stayed private, shared with family but not published. But they mattered. They mattered to Reckel, who built his post-war life partly on principles learned from enemies who treated him better than he expected or perhaps deserved. They matter to historians studying how to conduct warfare ethically, and they matter to anyone trying to understand that the choice between security and humanity is often false, that sometimes the most effective approach is also the most decent one. The Germans who arrived at British camps expecting execution and found tea instead experienced profound cognitive dissonance. Their propaganda had prepared them for atrocities. Reality offered something different, something they couldn't easily process or explain. That dissonance created openings for changing minds in ways coercion never could. Britain didn't win the war through kindness to prisoners. They won through military force, industrial capacity, Allied cooperation, and German strategic mistakes. But the decision to treat captured enemies decently revealed something about British character that military victories alone couldn't demonstrate. That even in total war, even facing an enemy that violated every standard of civilized conduct, Britain maintained principles that outlasted the conflict and shaped the peace that followed. The tea wasn't just tea, it was a statement that some standards transcend immediate military necessity, that how you treat powerless enemies reveals who you are more clearly than how you treat powerful friends. The German prisoners who drank that tea and went home carrying those lessons became living testimony that even in humanity's darkest moments, decency remains possible for those with courage to practice it.